Hi, I'm Ella Farrar-Smith, founder of DU. We want to create safe spaces for people to take part in research, but what does that actually mean? In this season of the DU podcast, we explore what safe looks and feels like for a variety of people with different professional and lived experiences. They share how they experience and create safety within their own practices and how they create space for themselves to do you. Welcome to the DU podcast. Today we have Anita Phagura, who's an EDI practitioner from the background in the construction industry, and you work quite a lot in the construction space still. I'm going to let you just quickly introduce yourself to me and to our listeners.
Thank you. Thanks, Ella. So my background was working within the construction industry as a railway project manager. My experiences there as a woman in a male-dominated industry led to certain challenges and barriers as I started to become aware of them. So the work that I now do is working with particularly the construction industry to support them to mitigate and eradicate those barriers and create inclusive spaces. And I also work with women and people of colour in those industries to support them with their career development.
Brilliant. So lots to bring to the table with regard to safe spaces and the subject matter of this podcast. Before we start in earnest, I tend to start with a few small quick-fire questions, if that's all right with you. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in Kent, which is close to where, I still live in Kent, so most of my life in Kent. I spent 1 year in America.
And who's your favourite person in the world?
Oh, I have to pick my son, who is 5, Kai, and he is my favourite person. Yeah, although there are some challenges sometimes, but he's always my favourite person.
I'm sure all parents can relate to that. Your favourite thing to do as a child?
I love to read and I love to write. So I would write on like scraps of newspaper. I'd write in the margins when I just find anywhere I could write or read.
What were you writing in the scraps of newspaper?
Maybe like stories and things.
Yeah, no, I like that. Your star sign?
Sagittarius.
Your favourite food?
Cake, sweets. I'm now gluten-free and don't eat dairy, so whenever I can find junk food that meets that requirement, I'm like in heaven. Sugar basically.
Yeah. What's your best trait?
I'm kind.
And your worst trait?
I interrupt sometimes.
I can relate to that. That's bad. Yeah. I can relate to that. Try and be more mindful of not interrupting people. So I think what would be really helpful, and you've sort of given a very brief overview of your background and stuff, but it'd be really great if you could just tell me, a bit about your work, how you got into it. Just tell me a bit more about that journey into where you are today. Yeah,
absolutely. So I spent over a decade in construction and railway, and it got to the point where I could take my redundancy, and I chose to leave the organisation I was at, but I still wasn't quite sure what I would do next. But at that point, thankfully, we had redundancy support, and that introduced me to a world of coaching, and my eyes opened up to possibilities and what I was really passionate about. And what came up was this real passion around equity, gender equity at the time, but a broader value of fairness. And so it also allowed me to reflect on my experiences in the day job and recognise those barriers. And I did some research with other women in project management, and I surveyed 100 women, and the opportunities they had and their stories, it was so fascinating, and that really led me to wanting to support particularly these women to not have to face the barriers that they were facing and the challenges, and support them to overcome it. So I started my work in coaching, and then over the years it's evolved into the training and working with organisations as well to eradicate and support people within the organisation, as well as working with the people facing the barriers. But it's definitely felt like an up and down journey. But I think for me, it's really coming from the point of having experience and having that lived experience within the industry, within facing certain barriers myself. That coupled with then empathy and understanding and this drive and value of fairness to support others. So although I said I interrupt, and that's me kind of just my brain working overdrive, but I'm also a really good listener. So even though I do interrupt, I have that capability of listening. So I think those things packaged up has allowed me to listen to and understand, those challenges at a deeper level, and also then use that to build the framework that I use to help people navigate those spaces and work with leaders to again support them to create the environments that are safe and create those opportunities.
So when we think about creating safe environments and spaces for people, what specifically do you think of? Like, what is it that comes to mind for you when I say that?
Yeah, so I think it's a real interesting concept. So I come from the construction industry, so safety is the number one thing that we talk about and that we care about. I mean, we care about other things, we care about meeting deadlines, we care about doing a good job, hopefully, but what is drummed into us, quite rightly, is about safety. However, my understanding of what safety is now has broadened than I think we typically associate within that industry. And again, partly from my own experiences, I reflected, and as I share my story with people, as I share The Only Woman in the Room, people are quite astounded about some of the things that were commonplace. And I can now recognise those experiences meant I wasn't safe at work. And many others aren't safe at work. And what we call microaggressions happen on a regular basis. And that then creates this environment where people aren't safe beyond physical safety. It's also not a safe environment for men, even though we're talking about some of it being a male-dominated industry. And some of the cultures are quite alpha male and quite toxic. So for me, safety is about having that broader definition of safety. I come from an organisation, and we had a safety vision, I suppose the word is, and it was everybody home safe every day. And it is what it says on the tin, right? If somebody goes to work, it's our responsibility, wherever we are in the construction project, whether we're on site or in the office making decisions, is that everybody comes home safe from work. And that should include not just their physical well-being, but their mental, spiritual and emotional well-being. And that's even if you're working from home, right? I was having some conversations with DEI practitioners, and we were exploring what are the goals of the work that we do. And we came up with a few different things, and we spoke about this idea of tolerance. Is that the goal? And tolerance sounds, well, it sounds a bit weak. It's like we're just trying to tolerate that other person. And I would love to get to the point of acceptance, that we accept everybody, but I also recognise that there are these real divisions. But what I came to was, well, the goal, at least what I'm trying to implement, is absolutely equity, more fair opportunities, but also it's about safety. Even if we disagree about things, we should hopefully all be able to agree that everybody deserves safety in all its forms.
A lot to unpack there in your answer, and I'm just thinking about you've mentioned certain people with certain characteristics. So I have a question around whether safety or creating a safe space changes depending on who you're thinking about, and I suppose when it comes to work environments and the concept of everyone home safe every day, which is a great concept, right? But that definition, I'm talking in circles a bit here, but your definition seems to have evolved over time.
No, it's such a great reflection. So a lot of the work I do is around coaching. So that can uncover some real I don't know, deep insights and people being able to share themselves with you. And it's absolutely fundamental to be able to create that safe space for them to do so. And within that, kind of me sharing some of my story and some of the stories around what I think around safety and the experiences of people in the industry, what I have come to realise as my definition has evolved and my thinking's evolved is a lot of people who are from marginalised groups who have experienced certain, well, we call them microaggressions, but also bullying and some really horrific stuff at work, even as well as those microaggressions that are happening so often, they are left with trauma and workplace trauma. And I never really thought about it in those terms before I started doing this work. But often when I'm coaching people, there are things that they've been through that they have to be able to process and move past and recognise that happened to them, feel what that has meant for them, to be able to navigate how they move forward. A lot of those experiences, I find, lead to certain behaviours or people feeling really stuck or worried or fearful. And that manifests in different ways, but that might mean that they don't put themselves forward for different opportunities. So it can manifest in so many different ways. And so if I'm creating this coaching environment and going in their homes, whether that's via Zoom, well, generally via Zoom, then for me it's really important, and for them it's really important, that we are genuinely safe to explore those things. And so from a coaching perspective, I have to make sure it's confidential. There's certain fundamental things of coaching that I need to communicate to the other person before we're even in that coaching relationship. So that's all part of it, but also recognising the topics that come up. For me, it's even more heightened. Again, in the coaching world, often I see this idea that people communicate like these ideas of toxic positivity and mindset is everything, but ignore how actually, yes, mindset really does matter, and your identity doesn't mean that you are, you can't be the first at something. It doesn't mean that you can't create success. It doesn't mean you can't create opportunities. But when we just put out these plateaus that are, well, anybody can do everything, actually we're really minimising people's experiences and minimising the challenges. So I think there is work to be done in the industry from that perspective. And then from the other side of the work that I do, which is more around training and coaching of leaders in industry who may not be from marginalised groups, and they are wanting to create safer environments for the people that work for them, they can often feel quite fearful or concerned or worried. They may not say that straight away, but around the topics of diversity and inclusion, and that can feel like a threat to people as well. And there's, lots of things that are said in the public discourse which filter into our workplaces, this idea that woke is a bad thing and they will be cancelled if they say the wrong thing. So there's just so much, again, to unpack there. And that could be quite a fearful or worrying experience. And people can feel like they're being attacked. So again, I have to be really mindful of how we create that safe space for those people as well, and create that environment where they can be heard and they can also hear.
Yeah, that's a really tricky sort of line to negotiate. And I know we sort of spoke about this previously, haven't we? Really interested to hear if you have any thoughts on like how you address that, like how do you do that?
I think it's really important to build those relationships in however you can. So with a coaching relationship, that is over a period of time, and I have to be upfront and be very clear and transparent from the beginning and aim to create that relationship. For training, ideally it's over a longer period of time, but sometimes they can just be one-off sessions. A session I did recently was on inclusive language with a leadership team within an organisation, and we were able to tackle so much in one session, but there is definitely a need for follow-up things. But the initial brief was a one-off session. So what I tried to do in that is, with the survey, make it anonymous and allow people to share what their concerns are, what their worries are, share some of their stories without being able to be identifiable. I don't know them. This information's not going to go in a form where it could be identified by other people within their team or their organisation. And hopefully that allowed them to be more open and share what those worries or concerns were, as well as what they wanted to achieve and where they want their journey to take them. And the session actually was online, and what we did was able to reflect some of those things back to the wider group, but also in a way where they didn't know who said what. And we were able to look at those concerns with some kind of fresh eyes and say, and reflect on, well, these are some of the concerns people have within the team. What can we do to acknowledge their concern, recognise its validity, but also support them to move forward and move beyond that? And it actually worked really well, because we used online tools, and we ended up using Google Jamboard. And I hadn't realised, but it was an extra layer of safety. I realised that people that joined the Jamboard, the leadership team, they're all able to join anonymously. So again, even in that setting, we had the concerns. They were already on I was using visual thinking, and we used metaphor, which again in the survey had come out as something a lot of people resonated with, this idea that us trying to be inclusive in our language, or people trying to be inclusive in their language, is like walking on eggshells. So we used that as a basis of the exercise, and within that, on post-it notes were people's concerns that they'd already shared, and in the Google Jamboard they were able to reframe or support people to move past each of those concerns. But again, they were also able to do that anonymously. And then we were able to, as a group, reflect on those things, how people may feel walking on eggshells, how we can support them to overcome those concerns. So there's not necessarily a one size fits all, but I think in that example, there were like layers of things that we could do to create that safety, and confidentiality and being anonymous was part of that. In a way, it enabled them to take themselves out of it. So although they were absolutely in it to reflect their concerns, in the session we were able to take ourselves out of it, and how will we support our colleagues with this? And we did have group discussions, and what came out of that was like a recognition that actually within this exercise, or within these thoughts of having these concerns, they're often about us. And it wasn't my language, but it was their language. They spoke about centering, and recognising there was some centering going on. So, and absolutely that was right, because that was what I had asked them to do. But the next part of the exercise, the follow-up, was, well, let's essentially put ourselves in the shoes of people who are facing these lived experiences. And I used another analogy, this idea of feeling like walking on a tightrope. And so again, we kind of moved the exercise forward to reflect on, well, what does that feel like for that person? I think it worked really well, because they were able to recognise different aspects of the same challenge that they maybe hadn't looked at from different positions, and take themselves out of it, and recognise, and that led to how would they support each other, how would they support members of their team that are going through different things. So it was really effective in that way, but it's absolutely part of the journey. It's not like we managed to reach an end result in one session, but it was well received.
Yeah, and how responsive do you find people are? Like, are people always aware what they need to feel safe, or just wondering about, at what points you ask that question, and whether you reflect on it throughout, or whether it's, you know, something done in advance or up front?
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly enough, I was on the other side of being asked that question in the coaching supervision that I do. I joined a new group, and my coaching supervisor, it's a group session, she asked, what do you need to be safe in this space? And I was like, such a good question, but it's so hard to answer.
That's what I mean. That's what I was thinking, because it's like, it makes sense. Ask people and they can tell you and it'll be fine. But actually, when I think about how do I answer that question, it's, you know, and it changes.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a need to revisit it as you develop the relationship or develop the topics that you're exploring. And my answer was, I don't know yet. I know some things that I need to feel safe, but also depending on what we're exploring, depending where I am that day, how I'm feeling emotionally that day, it will vary. So for me, it was a great learning curve being on the other end of that question. So again, that went into how I use that within the groups that I work with and the clients I work with. So in this particular case, I asked it up front in the survey, but I also asked it in a couple of different ways. So hopefully that could help elicit different ways of thinking about this idea of safety, and also just show how important it is. And then we did some up front, but then we also came together and reflected on it as a group, so we could see what some people felt. We looked at grouping up, what are the common themes, are there things that aren't as relevant now we're here in the session, are there things that are more relevant? I was mindful of the time because of how long we had in this particular session, but if in longer relationships or longer sessions, we can spend more time on those things, and again, just kind of explore the topic of safety from different perspectives, and coming together as a group allows you to build, well, somebody said this, so actually I now think of something that I hadn't thought of before.
And if you think about the opposite, you know, how it compares to people feeling unsafe, and I'm sure in the work you do that's never the case, but just I guess based on the experiences you've had across different, you know, parts of your journey, can you reflect on that difference? So
I think absolutely, like I think there are lots of topics that people will feel quite uncertain or worried about, and topics like inclusion, but also around people's career development. It's very personal, and if we don't address the idea of safety, it can be worrying for people. Like, so sometimes in the conversations before we get to our sessions, people may genuinely ask the questions of, will this be confidential? And what happens with the information I share with you? Because you're absolutely less willing to share things if you don't know the outcomes. And an interesting example of this actually was when I was running a session and we were in person. We were doing these sessions, we were meeting every month in person, and we were building such great relationships amongst the group. And then we had to go virtual because we were still in COVID times, and there had been a spike and everything was closed down in person. So for safety, COVID safety in this case, we took it virtually, and default assumption, without asking, we recorded the session. And midway through the session, the conversation came up, and I'm grateful that we were able to create that that space that was safe enough where people felt they could raise it. But the attendees, some of them just absolutely didn't bat an eyelid. They were not bothered if it was recorded or not, but there were some attendees that were willing to speak up and say, I'm less willing to either come off camera, or I'm less willing to share what I would share otherwise, because this session's being recorded. And the session was only being recorded in the sense that there may have been some people that couldn't make it that day, or if people might want to watch back, it was like, well, we can't do that in a live environment necessarily, but actually we kind of seen this as adding benefit, and it was a default assumption. But actually what that enabled was an honest conversation amongst the group of, well, this is your space, how do you want to move forward? do we want to record or not? And it was a really powerful lesson for me about making those default assumptions, and also giving that power to the group, that they could decide how they wanted to move forward. And there were people that were not that bothered, but they also recognised that actually for the people that it mattered to, it would be a safer environment to not be recorded. So there was a consensus of, no, we don't need to record this. And I found it really beautiful in how it evolved and how that conversation could come up and be resolved by the group, and they had the power to do that. And also the lessons that I learned of let's not make these default assumptions and give the power back to the people, the attendees, the people that are in that learning journey.
I think that's come up a lot, and it's really interesting. It comes up in research all the time. I mean, a lot of the research I do, I try to make participant-led. So, that is about power. And actually there are some power dynamics that you've touched upon as well when it comes to safety.
Yeah.
And that's an assumption on my part. I've experienced power dynamics when it comes to safety. Have you? And what has that maybe looked like for you?
So I'd really be interested to hear a little bit more about your experience, but if I offer what comes to mind for me, back to this construction environment, there are huge power plays that are relevant, as there often are in hierarchical organisations. And yet with safety, the goal often in a mature safety culture is, no matter your seniority, you are encouraged to voice your concerns about safety, your opinions, your things that could be better, your improvements. If you see unsafe behaviours, even if they're from a more senior member of staff, you are encouraged to raise them, and you are encouraged to stop unsafe practices on site, even if that has a real cost and time factor on a project. If you think something's unsafe, you should say it. That's what we're told in a mature safety culture. And you will not be penalised for that, and you will be thanked, even if you got it wrong. So that's the goal of mature safety cultures. But in how that plays out in practice, not always the case, and not all organisations do encourage that. Not all organisations do you really feel that's true. And I was sharing experiences with somebody the other day, and they were sharing how in that particular they've seen differences in different organisations, and in the organisation they were part of at the minute, that wasn't the case, even though we're in a construction industry. So there is a real cross-section of those experiences, but absolutely power dynamics is key to that, because does somebody feel that they can speak up and have the consequences of speaking up when they don't have the power? In construction, lots of people on site are often working in ways of working that are less secure. So they may be contracted, they may be on day rates or freelance, so they're there for that job. So if they call out some behaviour, will they get penalised and not be coming to work the next day? So there are real power dynamics in people being able to call out unsafe things at work. And kind of bringing it back to the work that I'm now focused on around inclusion, that absolutely mirrors in people who feel that they can speak up from marginalised groups, but also allies, and there can be a real backlash to speaking up on topics. Sadly, and often there seems to be that there's more of a backlash about calling out racism, for example, than the actual thing that somebody has deemed racist. It's like, there's more of a focus on the person that's called it out than the act that we could address and try and make better.
Yeah. And as you were speaking, I was kind of nodding my head going, yeah, that all sounds familiar. Because I think when it comes to research, there's various power dynamics. So within, agencies, they are hierarchical structures, and often it's the more junior people conducting field work on the ground. And so raising, maybe I don't feel safe going to this country or this part of the country to do research. Well, that could be problematic. It has implications for budget, has implications for what you're able to work on or not. Does that then therefore have an impact on your career progression? Maybe in theory, no. In practice, it can be quite different. And then there's also the power dynamics between the participant that you're speaking to and the researcher, and how you dress, how you speak, how you are. All of those things are, just massively important and have a big impact on where you get to and the information you get out as well of people, and ultimately you're there with an objective when you're in research, and oftentimes you might not have that much time, sadly. And again, that sort of comes down to budget constraints often as well, but depending on the methodology you're taking, you might be doing an in-home interview for 1 hour and you're in there and you've got some key objectives and you need to make sure you answer them. But even going in, if you're junior, I don't feel safe here, do you have the confidence to say, I'm just going to leave? Again, implications for budget and things like that. So many parallels, I would say, to what you described there.
No, thank you for sharing. I think it's fascinating, isn't it, how those power dynamics play out, and what a big impact that can have.
I'm just wondering about, I suppose, you have some familiarity with research, and I sort of described a little bit of what you do, and I just wondered if you have any thoughts on research and any tips or any learnings that we could maybe take forward and think about applying to make research a safer space for people to be able to take part in.
That's a great question. So in the work that I do, and my own experiences, particularly when I was in the day job, facing these things, it felt quite lonely. I felt like I was the only one going through these challenges or these barriers. And as I opened up more and was more willing to share, that kind of not necessarily lifted a weight, but it was a cathartic experience. People would tell me that by sharing I was supporting them to feel more seen and heard. And also then when I did my own research, people would tell me even that experience of taking part in research, they felt more seen and heard. And as I work with organisations who are trying to improve their inclusive cultures, a huge part of it is to hear the experiences of the people in your organisation. Often those people who feel unheard and unseen. And I think the other side of it is that we do have more of that happening now, but there's also a fatigue that people feel, I've told you this so many times and you're not willing to do anything with it. So I think in terms of research, and I don't know how much influence you have on this as a researcher, but I think there's a real power in enabling and creating the space where people can share their experiences, especially if they are feeling unheard and unseen and not often asked, but also that research matters, and it's not going to go sit on a shelf somewhere, that if we are trusting people or we are asking them to commit, whether that's their time or their energy or their emotional energy to share their experiences and insights, then we are able to do something with that hopefully makes things better, whether that's better for them individually or better in terms of the wider industry or the wider business, so that those experiences in a way aren't in vain, or those insights.
Yeah. And them sort of having a sense of what that means and knowing
Yeah.
what that means in
Yeah.
terms of tangible sort of steps forward. Yeah, it's interesting because that's the ideal.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily always immediately possible to know, or to hold your client to account to go, well, and what are you going to do? We need to tell our participants, you know, really good. But I think it's really helpful in terms of just framing and thinking about that and building that into the process, for sure.
And it might not be immediate, as you said. It might not be immediate, but just knowing that it's not a tick box exercise, that somebody's commissioning this research with some kind of purpose, some kind of influence, and you don't always know, and of course you don't know what the research is going to say yet, so you can't necessarily say what the next steps will be. But for me, particularly within organisations, it's let's not ask people if we're not willing to do something with that and make the commitment there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And how do you create a sense of safety in your everyday life? Is it something that you proactively think about for yourself as much as you do in your work?
It's a really good question. So, given my background in construction, this safety culture was drummed into us, quite rightly. But it was also, this isn't just how you live at work, it's how you live at home. So with my little boy, he's got the message of safety first, and my husband's quite risk averse as well, and he's got a bit of construction background. So like from early days, we've been like safety first. But I'm also aware that being very proactive on safety could also be quite risk averse. So I'm mindful that, like, as we're teaching our little boys safety first, that we are not, there aren't too many barriers in for him to play and have fun and climb trees and get into scrapes in real life. So for me, it's the interesting dynamic of, yes, prioritising safety, but doing it in a way that allows that creativity and real life experience. So I definitely see it in how we are raising my son and trying to strike that balance.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because actually, as you were speaking, I'm just reflecting now some of the examples you gave where things came up, i.e. the recording of the session that hadn't been agreed in advance. Although that was, you know, something that made some people feel unsafe, what it did was enable and allow a conversation to take place. They felt safe enough to raise it, and there was learning through it. And it just, as you were speaking about your son, it kind of, there's a parallel there, isn't it? It's quite interesting to consider, how sometimes having a bit of the opposite, not trying to create unsafe spaces, but, you know, having something there that people can bounce off of or push back on or react to can be quite helpful. Yeah,
because I think for the example with the recording, I think we probably learnt a lot more than if we just made the default assumption not to record.
Yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely. And it's how you create that safety. And some of it will have to be hard and fast rules, right? Especially in a construction type environment. There are some things that we can't take a risk on, but where can we create those spaces where it's flexible and is right for that environment, and we can create that space to learn and experiment.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, you might, you've referenced your construction past, but you haven't really spoken explicitly about it, and it's up to you if you want to here or not. But what, if anything, could have made those spaces safer for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the examples were bullying, and one of the cases was when I was actually managing somebody, and the person I was managing was she may have even said that I was a bully to her because there was a real energy or a real personality clash. But actually, and she openly shared this at one point in our journey, it was an age thing, it was a gender thing, and it was probably a race thing. She said, I've never been managed by a woman before, I've never been managed by somebody young before, But it's not because you're Indian. I was like, oh, it's not because of that. But so that was one particular experience, and there's been many, but in that experience, I very much felt that because I was the manager, I was the one who had to change my behaviours. I was the one who had to adjust and make the environment supportive for her and get the best out of her. How could I get her to do the best work? And that was my responsibility. And although I did speak to my boss at times, there was some real kind of power plays and toxic things going on in that wider, in terms of the relationships. And I felt very alone. So now I can reflect that actually what would have made it safer for me was the support and not being alone. So I look back at that example and and many others, and I'm like, actually I didn't have any support above me. I maybe had friends, or I had friends at work or close colleagues that I could share with, or that all those people at home that I was taking things home with me. But I never really felt I had the management support or leadership support. And partly, like, I never made formal complaints because I was like, oh, it's only this small thing. But even in that case, it was sexism, it was racism. But at the time I'm like, I've got to own this, it's my responsibility. So partly it was me sharing, but others also saw what was going on and there wasn't that support for me.
Yeah, well, great reflections, thank you. The last question I'm asking all my guests is this idea of how do you do you?
How I do me is I openly share my feelings and perspectives, but I'm also aware of where I can have boundaries about these things so they don't deplete me, which has been an evolution. I try and lean into that authenticity as much as I can, but also aware where it's safe to share and who I can share those aspects of me with. I'm definitely a talker. I've recently discovered that I've probably got ADHD. So for me to be me, it's that again comes back to that safety and be those close relationships, but also in wider spaces, sharing perspectives, stories, and feeding that out.
Amazing. Thank you, Anita. It's been really brilliant. And you're going to do a bit of a demonstration of, do you want to tell us what you're going to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So often what I do is coaching or training. So I'm like, oh, how do we demonstrate that? So I'm going to invite you into a coaching session. And I thought because we are doing something visual here that we could bring in some visual thinking and drawing tools within that.
I'm definitely not going to promise anything on my drawing capabilities. But
and you don't need to be able to draw, and I can't draw, so it's all good.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for being a guest. It's been really amazing. I think we've uncovered some really helpful things when it comes to safe spaces and thinking about that with research. So thank you for being my guest.
Thank you so much. So, Ella, we're going to look at how you feel about drawing and some of the worries that we might have about doing an activity like this. So, but you absolutely do not have to be a drawer or anything, so no expectations on this activity.
Okay.
And so I'm going to deliberately ask you to draw with your non-dominant hand. So are you left or right-handed?
I'm right-handed.
So with your left hand. Okay, and choose your colour.
Okay.
And you can use more than one if you would like. Yeah, and I'll do it with you. So just going to ask you to draw with your non-dominant hand a squiggle. Make it big, fill the page, and just go for it, keep going.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's weird not using my right hand.
So I'm going to ask you now to create that into a monster. It can have hands, legs, eyes, nose, mouth, however you like, but create it into a being.
Okay.
Done?
I think so, yeah.
Fabulous. What you've drawn is your inner critic.
Scary.
Scary, is it?
Yeah.
I'd love you to give your inner critic a name.
What to say it to you?
Yeah.
Oh, the drawing monster.
Oh, I love it. Okay, so can you think about what the drawing monster is saying to you about your drawing ability? So pop some post-it notes and just have at it.
Okay.
Mine is called Jeff.
Oh, now I'm wishing I gave mine like a more, you know.
Oh, you can change your name. You can change your name.
No, he's the drawing monster.
So, how did it feel with the drawing monster saying these things to you?
I wanted him to stop. I was like, how many post-it notes should I write about how bad I am at drawing?
So I'm going to ask you for the next part of the exercise, which is to switch the message. So in a different colour, cross out what they've said and ask, and I want you to switch the message on it. So recognise what's still true about it, but what you want the monster to be saying to you instead. So I'll give you an example. Jeff tells me I can't draw. So what I can change that to is, I can say that I don't need to be good at drawing, but I am having fun while I draw. So you think about what you want drawing monster to say instead. And the other thing I should mention is drawing monster talks in a silly voice.
Okay.
So when you're thinking back what they've said to you, read it to yourself in a silly voice.
Okay. Okay.
So would you like to share one?
So I had one that said rubbish at drawing, and I changed it to I make drawings out of rubbish.
I love it. So how did you find that exercise?
Interesting. To be fair, just to show everyone, I quite like my drawing. I quite like my drawing of my drawing monster. So, don't know, maybe like the fact that I just did it with my, didn't care, the scribbles sort of allowed a bit more freedom to not worry about trying to draw something specific, and that then made it feel like more creative.
I love it. Thank you so much for taking part.
Thank you.